Good morning readers, it's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf and welcome to another bookish breakfast. So, I have finally fixed the issue that my phone was having where it was only letting me record a couple of minutes of video at a time. So today we will probably be seeing a return of the usual excessively long video format. Once again, it has been a very low reading week. I have read a few more chapters of Pride and Prejudice. I'm going to save talking about that for maybe a future video and maybe do a Pride and Prejudice review of one of my favourite books. So that could be interesting. And what else have I read? Pretty much. Oh, I read One Man, Two Governors for the Discussing Drama project that I'm doing with Roz at Scandally Dandling about the books, but that is in a separate video which you can find elsewhere. I might link it below. So that is the limit of what I've read this week. Last week I said you probably are fed up of people talking about the situation, and last week we decided not to talk about the situation here on Bookish Breakfast. But this week I thought maybe it was time to think about some aspects of how the world that we're living in, the way that the world that we're living in is changing and has changed very rapidly in the last couple of months. Well, I've got a cat who doesn't want to participate. Come on. Apologies. There we go. So yeah, how the world that we're living in is changing, and how that will affect sort of cultural and literary phenomena, if that makes sense. So as I've probably mentioned, I work in a hospital, and a lot of you have been saying some really nice, lovely, kind things about the work that we're doing, and I've been feeling a little bit bad about that because up until this week I have literally just been doing my normal job, but wearing the equivalent of a two-man tent while I do it. Which, whatever your normal job is, if you try to imagine doing that whilst wearing a tent, you might get some impression of what it's been like. But it's been fine. It's been okay. Obviously things are changing pretty rapidly. We do have, the reason I don't tend to say exactly what my job is, exactly where I work and what I do, because we have some certain guidelines for social media. I'm going to say that the majority of people completely flout them, and I just am personally maybe a little bit stricter with myself than perhaps I need to be. But I think if it's not a matter of confidentiality, and it's not a matter of me presenting a bad impression of a healthcare professional, then there is a reasonable interest in what it is that we're doing and how we're adapting the systems that we have to the situation as it develops. And that's not something that I really particularly wanted to bore you with, as it were, but if you do have an interest in hearing more about that, let me know and I'll see what I can figure out how to say without saying anything that I feel like I'll be told off for. Not that anyone will really watch it. What I don't want to do basically is, a couple of times in the media recently there's been a healthcare professional who's made some kind of video or some kind of post, and that post has been, gone viral when that person wouldn't necessarily have expected it to, and then caused implications in various ways. Obviously, I don't think anything is at risk of going viral from BookTube, but you do have to think about anything that you do put on the internet. So that was a very long-winded way of saying, let me know if you're interested to hear more about what work is like at the moment. You may well not be, and that might be the wisest thing, because sometimes just focusing on other aspects of life can be better in a situation like this. So, like I said, to the bookish stuff, today I wanted to talk about how we might speculate that COVID-19 is going to impact on literature going forward. So whenever there is a huge, influential global event, it has repercussions throughout the world of literature and throughout culture as a whole. So there's a couple of different aspects of this that, the cat's on my lap now, so I can't look at my notes. So I'm thinking about things like World War I, World War II, and other major events like that. Obviously, most of the events that I'm going to mention are wars, because those are the events that are, most that we've had most of in the 20th century and start of the 21st century. But that doesn't mean to say that this won't also have an impact. When it comes to the First World War, obviously that was the most recent pandemic that we've had is Spanish flu, but the cultural impact of Spanish flu was kind of enveloped in the existing cultural impact of World War I, so you can't really count it on its own separately. In terms of pandemics and epidemics, you could look back and say something like the cholera outbreaks that there were in London in the Victorian era had a massive cultural impact in that they really changed the way, eventually, with time to take effect, they really changed the way that people lived and the way that people kind of accessed their basic necessities in terms of sanitation and so on. Bye bye cat. So what I'm saying is that these things that affect the way that people behave in the short term then have implications later on down the line for the way in which we tell stories, talk about things, and just live and interact with one another. So certain ways in which that might unfold in books. The first one is a characterization. So I was thinking about in terms of how characters who have been to war are portrayed in various works of fiction. So, for instance, you could have a story in which the characterization and indeed the plot is principally driven by a character's experience of the war or the critical situation. So, for instance, The Return of the Soldier by Rebecca West. That story of a soldier affected by memory loss, query PTSD, related to the impact of the First World War, it would not be possible without that war, and without the way that it's a shared experience for everyone in the story, but a very pivotal experience for just the character of the soldier. And in other kinds of books, the experience that a character has in a critical event can also be used to highlight their values and their strengths and their weaknesses. So I was thinking it's almost like it can be like a lazy plot device almost, or characterization device, sorry, in terms of, oh yeah, this character had a bad war, or this character did something a little bit dodgy during the war, like we're not sure which side this character was on, or whether they were good or bad during that period. And just being able to use that shorthand to kind of cast aspersions onto a character, or present a character as being good if they had a heroic role in the war. If you're able to say, oh yeah, he was a general who won a battle, that can convey a certain character very easily as well. I'm thinking about like an Agatha Christie book where they very quickly summarise the character and they use things like that as a shorthand. So I was thinking in terms of the characters that we might see in terms of like doctors and nurses might start cropping up a little bit more in the stories that we see in the future. People who are other kinds of frontline workers as well, and patients, so people who recover from coronavirus. Not only are they going to be, future authors, but they're going to be future kind of main characters who are kind of like coming to terms with illness and the repercussions of that, and that would be something that will be interesting to possibly a wider variety of people than it otherwise would have been interesting to. So I think that character development will be affected in books set in the contemporary age. Character development will be affected by using experiences during COVID-19 as a method of developing that character. Clarity is not strong today. The other way in which previous critical events have affected literature include themes. So, let me think about this. Themes. So after World War II, I feel like there was, I didn't really research for this, I just thought and then I just spoke, you can probably tell. But after World War II, I feel like there was an increase in stories about sort of dystopias, in particular authoritarian states, such as something like 1984. Whereas after, say, 9/11, there was an increase in books that focused not only on the theme of terrorism, but also on the theme of what makes a person do a terrible thing, and what drives a person to that point, and what motivations do people have. So books that kind of analysed that kind of perspective. So I think there is going to be a change in the themes that we see coming out of this pandemic. There will be different themes that people will be interested in. Obvious ones will include, obviously, topics of health and illness, but I think it's going to be deeper than that, and it's going to be more than just, people getting ill and getting better. It's going to be, I'm going to say it, fundamental questions will emerge that we didn't kind of realise that we had before, that literature will then go on to explore. And that's not something that you can predict, but I predict that there will be certain themes that will become more relevant after the pandemic. Then another way that in which you can't precisely predict the way that it's going to have a direct impact, but likely some impact will occur, is in the style of people's writing. So I'm thinking about the aftermath of World War I, where we kind of really saw the emergence of stream of consciousness, and a book like Mrs. Dalloway, which again uses the characterization of a soldier to drive part of the sort of the plot story characterization. But the impact of the war and the impact of the sort of mental health aspects of that war also impact on the style of the writing. So I think that there will be changes in the way in which stories are structured and told and developed that, again, we couldn't really predict. So, I've written down here right at the bottom of my list, but another global event that had an impact on literature, Steve Donoghue mentioned in his video about his Penguin copy of the story of the Crusades, that the Crusades had a massive impact on literature, apparently, but you'd have to go to Steve Donoghue's video to find out a little bit more about that, because I can't remember exactly what he said. Another way in which I predict there will be an impact, not necessarily on the literature itself, but on our experience of it, is that this is a massive shared experience, and every country is actually going through a relatively similar process right now in very different ways, but the basic steps are the same, in that there's like an increase in infections, there's an increase in responses, there's lockdowns that are covering billions of people around the world. I think billions. Last time I looked it was 1 billion, and there have been more lockdowns since. So yeah, more and more people are being affected by very, very similar sets of events. So what that's going to mean is that the impact on literature is not limited to the Western world. It's going to be a global impact. So what we might see is that books that are written in other parts of the world from where we would normally read stories from, bad sentence, become more relevant to us, if that makes sense. So a lot of people do make an effort to read books from outside of their normal cultural world, and we've got like reading in translation readathons and stuff to encourage that, and various like reading challenges that kind of focus around that. But I think one reason that in the mainstream we don't see many books that come from other countries is because they sometimes aren't as culturally relevant once you translate them and bring them across, and people like to read things that they can relate to. Like, that's why relatable is one of the favourite words on describing popular characters and so on. So I think that because COVID-19 is going to be something that we can all relate to, the fact that it's a shared experience means that authors around the globe will be writing about the same thing, and then we'll be reading books from other countries that will seem more familiar and seem more shared. So I think it could be a really positive thing in terms of encouraging us to read more from around the globe and see different perspectives of the same event. So that was one other thought. And the final thought that I had is that there are certain stories that are no longer going to be as relevant. So I can't really think of exactly a story to compare this to in existing literature, but the reason I was thinking about this is because over the last few months I've been trying to start writing a book of my own, and it was going to be a work of fiction that was going to have the starting point of somebody dying in ICU, and the rarity of that event was going to be kind of like key to how the impact that it has. But a death in ICU, unfortunately, is becoming more and more common, and something that more and more people are aware of. And the idea of focusing a story around the unusualness of the grief of an unexpected ICU death is going to be completely changed. So that plot and that themes that I had worked out there would have to sort of substantially change to be relevant to the future after the pandemic. Likewise, a lot of books that are set in a sort of semi-contemporary world authors will have to decide, is this a semi-contemporary world before the pandemic, or am I going to make some reference to the pandemic? Because it's going to change so many things, and you won't be able to write a book that feels like it's set round about now. It's going to have to be either set before the pandemic or after the pandemic, or during, I suppose. And that's going to have implications in terms of plotting and so on, because if you're setting after or during the pandemic, you've got to think about, like, characters, the impact that social distancing will have on your characters' movements and motivations. And if you're setting before the pandemic and you want it to be like a real world, you're also kind of leaving people with the impression that those characters are then about to go into experiencing what we're experiencing now, and that could affect sort of the foreshadowing and things in the book. So that was just a thought. So the next section, as it were, is that obviously the culture that we have had up to now is not going to disappear. And one other thing that happens when there is a critical cultural incident, I don't really know what to call this, a situation, when there is a situation, the existing literature that we have then gets reinterpreted to help it to explain, or to help us to explain, using our past literature, the situation that we now face. So I'm sure a lot of us have seen those versions of Hamlet where it is kind of like a surveillance state, or versions of, I think, well, there was the film of Coriolanus that was set in a warring nation. What I'm expecting that we will see within, say, 6 months of lockdown ending, we will see a staging or a filming of a Shakespeare play that is set in a pandemic situation. I don't know which play it would be. I appeal to the Shakespeare buffs out there to tell me which of Shakespeare's plays would be the most relevant to staging during a pandemic, if there's one that mentions like illness and so on. The one that leapt into my mind was Romeo and Juliet, purely because of scenes like "I bite my thumb at you, sir," and the implications that we're now seeing around sort of like spitting and uncovering your mouth and coughing and so on. The idea of like, I'm biting my thumb and like flicking stuff at you, it's like deliberately infecting somebody. Obviously a plague on both your houses doesn't really need much explaining, and also the fact that physical closeness, in terms of a romance story, physical closeness is so important. And if you're working in an environment that we will be working in where it has become completely normal, you know, like last week's quote, ordinary is just what you're used to. We will be used to being 2 meters away from people. We will potentially quite soon be used to wearing masks in public places. And if that's the case, the act of taking off a mask or the act of stepping closer to somebody is going to have an enormous resonance that it didn't previously have. And I think a plot in which people want to come together but are being forced to stay apart would have an interesting extra dynamic added if it was also set in an environment of social distancing. I'm not sure exactly how it would work, but I'm sure somebody could work it out. But yeah, I'm sure somebody will run a version of a Shakespeare play where the actors are wearing masks in the outside scenes and so on. So yeah, look forward to seeing that. And another way in which we reinterpret our pre-existing culture is through retellings. So we see more and more of them these days, retellings of popular older stories. So I personally am looking forward to seeing a retelling of Persuasion, in which Dr. Anne Elliot breaks up with poor lab scientist Frederick Wentworth, and then finds out 7 years later that he was instrumental in the team developing the vaccine against COVID-19. And then, you know, do they get back together? Don't they get back together? Of course they do, because it's Persuasion. But yeah, I feel like I would just like to see that story told one day. So yeah, so that's a couple of my thoughts on how culture would be changed by the impact of coronavirus. I would love to hear what you think, and whether you agree with me or disagree with me, or think that, you know, I'm talking absolute nonsense, which is a possibility because I'm running a little bit low on sleep. But yeah, I would like to hear whether you also think that this will have a cultural impact, and if you do, if there are aspects of that cultural impact that you think that I've missed, let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, take care, stay safe, you know, good luck with everything. You know, stay at home, keep your distance from people, but stay happy as well, because we're all doing our best and we're all doing, you know, as well as we can do, and that's a great thing. And happy reading if you are a little bit more effective at reading than I am. Bye.